Good evening. Swagatam Shubha Swagatam Ati Swagatam Shubha Swagatam. Welcome to our opening plenary. We'd like to acknowledge with deep gratitude and honor the Choctaw, Homa, Chitimacha, Biloxi, and other diverse groups of indigenous people on whose lands this NCA conference is about to take place. This session is on the greater regard for academic freedom, and my name is Srivi Ramasubramanian. I'm from Syracuse University, and it's my honor to be the moderator for this panel. As we know, over the last few years, the attacks on higher education have really ramped up, and there's been an offensive against the so-called woke intellectual discourse that has inspired state-level offensives and institutional moves that violate core principles regarding academic freedom. And it is in this context, especially, that we want to highlight campus speech regarding Palestine that has been suppressed in multiple places. And given the events of the 2023 presidential address and the work that's been put together by the NCA task force on academic freedom, we thought it would be a wonderful way to reflect on academic freedom as the initial opening session of NCA. And so here we are thinking through multiple threats on academic freedom that people from many different aspects of our communities want to discuss and bring to the forefront, including about racial justice, disability justice, and linguistic injustices, and the ways in which communication could play a role, and NCA could play a role in standing up for academic freedom. So welcome and thank you for being here. The way this session is going to work is that I will be introducing each member of the panel, and they will then speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. And each of them has posed a question for reflection, which will come up on the slide. And we will pause for a few seconds so that we can honor the active and deep listening aspects of communication as part of our panel today. And at the end, after all of the panelists have had a chance to talk about the ways in which they enter the conversation about academic freedom, we will then have an opportunity for you to reflect on those questions and have any comments or questions that you have for the panels, in which case you can come up here to share your thoughts, and there are 2 mics here for the audience. So it's my honor to start by welcoming Walid Adel Afifi, who's a professor of university at California, Santa Barbara, and also an associate dean and director of community engaged initiatives in the Division of Social Sciences. He's also the immediate past president of NCA. His research focuses on uncertainty impacts, and his service roles have focused on creating an inclusive, accessible, and community-centered university at UC Santa Barbara, but also more widely within the communication discipline. So it's my pleasure to welcome Walid to talk to us about academic freedom from his perspective. Thank you.
First of all, I apologize for, I'm going to be doing reading for most of this. I've just learned that both because of time and because of the content matter, I generally prefer to write down most of what I'm going to say on this. First, I want to thank Justin Danowski for proposing the idea of this conversation as the opening session after the cancellation of my 2023 presidential address. Thank you, Justin. I also want to note that a drawing of this session will be made by an artist and will be published once complete to serve as a permanent record. I also want to thank LaShawn and Aliyah for all the labor that her team do to pull off this conference. I was witness to it as first VP and ever since, and the entire staff at NCA. And finally, I want to thank the staff at this hotel, and including all the way in the back, who labor tirelessly, and without which this would not be possible. Let's give a round of applause to all these folks. I speak to you on the 412th day of the genocide in Gaza, with 50,000 Palestinians killed, many, many more injured, and Gaza turned into rubble. Last year, as president of the LA, at the Wednesday meeting of the LA, I was overseeing the meeting and kept having this sort of thought that was creeping through my head. And at the end, I wrote some things down. Part of what I wrote down is the following. And then I shared it with the LA at the end. I do my best to resist the thirst for judgment from people who are not living the ongoing violence and displacement that my community is experiencing, nor what it takes to simply exist in this moment, let alone perform. Thank you to those of you who have held others during this time. Little did I know how prophetic those words would be and how necessary I would be relying on those who were holding me in the days and months that followed. I'll be discussing academic freedom in 3 very short chapters in this talk. Chapter 1 is academic freedom. خلينا نحكي عن الحرية الأكاديمية. بين 6 تشرين الأول 2023 و16 يناير 2024 قتلت إسرائيل 4327 طالباً فلسطينياً و231 معلماً ومدير مدرسة. سأكرر بطريق مختلف. في فترة 4 أشهر قتل عدد من الطلاب والمعلمين الفلسطينيين أكبر من جميع الذين سيحضرون هذا المؤتمر. In the past 408 days, Israel has also completely or partially destroyed 281 government schools and 65 UN schools. 90% of Gaza's educational infrastructure has sustained varying degrees of damage. This is not even to begin discussing the complete destruction of archives in Gaza. Let's talk about academic freedom. On January 15th of 2024, I emailed 2 of my Palestinian co-authors, Rana and Salsabil, to check in on their safety. Salsabil, 2 days later, responded this way, quote, "Hi, Walid. Thank you for checking on us and hope you are well and safe. Rana is dead." Chapter 2. Repression of Palestine speech. Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of racism that silences, excludes, erases the stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. It includes justifying violence against Palestinians and reframing Palestinians and their allies with slander such as being inherently anti-Semitic, a terrorist threat or sympathizer, or opposed to democratic values. A recent survey of 1,200 students, staff, and faculty, the majority of whom were not Palestinian, showed that 63% of respondents reported experiencing silencing, exclusion, harassment, physical threat of harm, or defamation while Palestinian human rights, and 88% had witnessed others experiencing anti-Palestinian racism either directly or online. 55% of respondents were afraid to speak about Palestine. and 82% reported experiencing harm to mental or physical health at least once or twice during the experiencing or witnessing of anti-Palestinian racism. This past year has seen a relatively new tactic, the use of Title VI as a method for repressing Palestine speech. In the past year alone, hundreds of complaints have been made through Title VI accusing universities of anti-Semitism. Last August, NYU added Zionism as a protected class, making advocacy for Palestine impossible without violating anti-discrimination policies. In fact, my existence in itself becomes a discriminatory reality on campuses in that framework. Kenneth Marcus, the former head of the Federal Office of Civil Rights under Trump, predicted the new Trump administration would quote, take much more seriously the prospect of denying federal funds to colleges and universities that violate the rights of Jewish and other college students, unquote. A policy that could effectively make federal educational funding contingent on repression of pro-Palestine speech. So let's be very clear. Anti-Semitism, which is the term developed to name the hatred of Jewish people, has a long history and is still very much in existence today. Let's also be clear that Judaism, a religion centered on justice, is not Zionism. Zionism is a political project that began in the late 19th century, resulted in the creation of the State of Israel through a settler colonial project, and that project has required the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians for its maintenance. Zionism exists today in flesh through the actions of the Israeli state, including the ongoing genocide. As a side note, and further evidence that Zionism is not the same as Judaism, the number of Christian Zionists far outnumbers Jewish Zionists. Why is this important to name? Because the conflation of Judaism with Zionism is an essential tactic to create fear and repression. It is also what has led me to question the consequences of merely speaking these words. Chapter 3, Fear. Last month, I scrolled the NCA webpage that includes videos of several of the past presidential addresses. The last one listed, video and transcript and all, was 2022. There will never be a presidential address for the first Palestinian president of our association. The speech of Ahlam Muhtasib, to whom I'd given the floor to speak for the experience of the Palestinian community at NCA, was deemed unspeakable. An hour prior, I received an urgent text from an officer, NCA officer, that we needed to talk. I called, quote, "They are about to cancel the whole thing," unquote. It quickly became clear that although the words of the other speakers to whom I'd given the floor were also deemed a quote-unquote threat from which NCA, quote, might never recover, unquote, Dr. Muhtasib's words about genocide and her call to free Palestine were deemed simply too much. This is neither the place nor the time to discuss the ways in which that violence and many conversations and decisions since affected Dr. Muhtasib, myself, Palestinians at NCA broadly, larger allied communities, and here I note that Palestinians are far from the only community that NCA has harmed historically, and relationships that I had. I made a decision to stay with NCA, despite the emotional and relational consequences of doing so, for reasons that I'm comfortable with and that I stand by. I understand that the decision felt like additional violence to some. Whether the decision to fight for NCA in these ways were the right ones are yet to be seen. But it is time to ask, what made it so that Palestine was a red line? What made it so that even when the theme of the conference itself was freedom, Palestine was deemed a red line? What did that moment reveal about NCA and larger infrastructures? And what role does fear play? This panel is not the first nor the last to ask these questions, but I appreciate the opportunity to do so. We at NCA have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Violate. Very moving speech. And he leaves us with this question to reflect on. How do we combat the ways in which the construction of fear is weaponized in service to supremacist structures? As we pause on that question, I now invite the next speaker, Sienna Vincent, who's a third-year undergraduate student right here in New Orleans, Tulane University, studying political science with minors in gender and environmental studies, and is involved in activist work both on and off campus. So here we are. We can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sienna. My pronouns are they, she, and as I was just introduced, I'm a third-year student at Tulane. I have had a history of being in activism in college and before. I was in some rallies, an art display and a book display, as you can see here, and we attempted to plan a vigil on Tulane's campus. During all of these, we faced repression from the administration, and the vigil was not allowed to continue because although we wanted to put it forward as a way for our community to come together and grieve, we were not allowed to invite anyone who was not a Tulane affiliate to our event. Additionally, at one of the rallies that we were at, we were locked out of the building and told that we had to exit through a group of angry students who had threatened us. At the art display, someone came up to me and told me they wanted to burn what we had made and rip all of the art down. Additionally, at the book display, someone came up and checked out all of the books. We rallied and put more back there, but after that, we were not allowed, no one was allowed to check out books, which kind of defeated the purpose of the display. However, with that, we continued and persevered. And I'd like to put a trigger warning here. I'm going to be describing police violence. Please take care of yourself. So on April 29th, Tulane students, Loyola students, and pro-Palestinian protesters from across the city came together and set up an encampment on Tulane's front lawn. I myself was there for about 10 minutes when I was arrested. During my arrest, I was put on the ground and a horse kicked my head. I was checked out by medical personnel and told that I should probably go to the hospital, but instead I went to jail. I spent a couple hours there and was released that night. The next morning, while I was at court, I received a notification that I was under interim suspension, which meant that I was not allowed to return to my school. At that time, I lived on campus, which meant at 19 years old, I was homeless in the city of New Orleans. My parents were out of the country, and I didn't have a car or any place to stay. Luckily, because I have such an amazing community to support me, I found a place to stay that night, and my parents were able to come and find me a place to stay later. I'm forever grateful to the people who came together to help me after that. Although I was not allowed to attend most of the encampment from being banned from Tulane, I'd like to say that I've been told it was an incredible amount of community that was represented there. There was dancing, free food for anyone who came who was donated by the community. Of course, camps, there were chanting and singing, an art build, and free books to be given out to educate people. And it lasted for 36 hours. However, on May 1st, Mike Fitz, Tulane's president, decided that we needed to call Louisiana State Police to clear the encampment. Louisiana State Police arrived with rubber bullets, snipers, and Bearcats, which is another term for a tank, to clear peaceful student protesters. This was after having called NOPD and Tulane PD. These peaceful protesters were forced off, and 14 people were arrested, in addition to the 7 arrested on the first day and 1 more arrested later. This next picture was taken by a friend of mine. These are Louisiana state troopers pointing guns at myself, my friends. One of my friends was hit with a rubber bullet. Another person I knew got severely injured because of this. And honestly, I think this picture really speaks for itself. This is the kind of thing that we were dealing with instead of going to our midterms. So the question is, what happened after that? I was not allowed on campus, as I said, but over 200, close to 300 faculty members and over 1,000 students came together and signed an open letter about demanding immunity for the people who were suspended and arrested. The administration did not listen. I know friends of mine who have been suspended from Tulane, who are allowed to go to classes but nothing else, who may not be allowed to return to Tulane next semester, and myself, I'm currently on disciplinary probation. The reason why I'm here is because I wanted to share this information with you and tell you it is very difficult to be a student activist right now, but I also would like to say that the reason that any of this could happen, the reason that I'm here today, and the reason that I was able to get through these past 7 months are because of community members and people like you who care and who show up. So I would like to leave you with a question about what you can do now. Thank you.
Sienna's question for us to reflect on is, to what extent do you, as an educator or learner, participate in, benefit from, or succeed in the system that curbs academic freedom? Very powerful. Up next, we have Sara Amira de la Garza, who's an emeritus professor at Arizona State University, having been active with NCA, SCA since 1980. Amira's work centers ethnography and critical cultural studies through indigenous embodiment. She's the author of the book Maria Speaks: Journeys Through the Mysteries of the Mother in My Life as Chicana, and is currently working on 2 books, Meditations of a Mindful Heretic and Chicanography as Indigenous Critical Narrative Tradition of Colonial Resistance. Thank you. You're welcome.
In the words of my ancestors, I greet you. Guiraba, Piali, Shalom, Buenas tardes. How do these things happen? When I attended my first NCA, or rather SCA, in 1980, I was far less vocal than I will be today. Although I had been a successful forensics competitor, direct expression of my own message was largely reserved for contexts where I felt I would be heard, where there was a likelihood of mutual engagement, something that in many ways I still do, despite my direct style, my ability to disrupt and critique in order to be heard. The field had begun to shift during my undergraduate years, so that from the emphasis on rhetoric, performance, and public speaking in my freshman year, by the time I graduated 3.5 years later, I was being asked to consider graduate school by not only my debate coach, Don Brownlee, but my rhetoric professors, William DiMuggio and Victoria O'Donnell, and my professor of the new IPCO, Interpersonal and Organizational Communication, Don Beck. The field was alive with the notion that one cannot not communicate, that when we engage in conversation or speech, we are doing more than speaking, we are accomplishing something, performing. The Quarterly Journal of Speech was full of reflective considerations on the significance of this, while others were considering that we needed to become a social science, become organizational consultants, rename and rebrand our field. The consideration of academic freedom was subsumed or perhaps abandoned, and any widely held discussions of marginality or culture, race, or gender were rare, as the growing capital of becoming a social science led us to privileged pressures wielded by sociologists, psychologists, and the neoliberal turns on our campuses. Deep consideration of the unreliable nature of meaning, ambiguities in interpretation, and problematic patterns, spirals, and binds of the communicative process gave way to 8-character SPSS variable labels and years of study mimicking the authoritative voice of social science. Our articles written in a structure and style reflecting the research methods that we were busy learning from methodologists in other disciplines. We obsessed with insisting communication was particular, asking repeatedly, what makes this communication? Not so much, I would venture to suggest, to satisfy our sense that we had any idea what the answer to that question was, but to make the case that somehow we were a distinct discipline for those who needed to approve new departments and budgets for disciplinary classifications on our campuses. The politics of social comparison and socioeconomic cachet in the academy would win time and again over the deeper questions that largely remained unexplored regarding what it is that we are doing when we communicate, not as a jigsaw puzzle of variables that would never be assembled to answer that question, but the deeper questions of how our communication in practice creates and maintains the iterations of power and culture and repressive structures and roles for who can speak, define, and question the themes and concerns pervasive in our society. Operationalization functioned to mute voices while raising publication counts. All the while, academic freedom has largely sat like an unopened sacred text on our shelves, supporting the sense that somehow these questions are table dressings and not substantive to sustained and systematic attention within our intellectual community and discourse. I have, from the very start of my doctoral studies, been fascinated by the ferocity of head nodding at conventions when we speak. As if this nonverbal sign of assumed agreement or understanding, perhaps approval, sufficed to hold at bay the need for deep critical thought, dialogue, sound conflict, and dissenting voices. Through a performed discourse of decorum, creating the semblance of having heard or understood, difficult conversations and dissent were kept at bay, voices that needed expression not heard. And over the years, it is the cultural norms of repetition, performances of professionalism as scholars, and organizational and institutional rituals of evaluation and membership that have largely prevailed. Today, the long-neglected need to address the festering questions, grievances, and demands has burst through the dynamics of a world facing cultural, racial, economic, and ecological crisis. The historical legacies of prejudice, racism, class, and privilege culturally encoded into the academy and norms of human interaction have never been fully examined or addressed. To do this, we must learn to sustain courageous practices of uncomfortable and difficult dialogue forever. We must decide whether maintaining a fragile and indeterminate identity as a discipline can justify the silence and muting of realities and bodies under the guise of a tradition that was never really ours. We share in the social construction and reproduction of systems of inequality that have been reinforced through the last 50 years with no actual unified goal or vision. The question of academic freedom begs us to learn to establish what I have called a collective praxis of courage, to face on a daily basis the questions of how we do what we do and how our own professionalization and success has caused us to internalize the colonialism, racism, capitalism, inequities, and injustices of a system we may critique but continue to accept as the arbiter of our status and worth. Voices cry for abolition while simultaneously demanding support from the systems targeted for abolition. We boycott participation while insisting that we be heard. We need to learn how to place our comfort on the line and privilege understanding and community, to hear and work with a dynamic and sustainable coexistence that avails itself of our many strengths. Everyone must have a chance to be heard, or our solutions are flawed. Guira ba, we are all one. In the words of my Raramuri ancestors, Guira ba. Academic freedom is only necessary because we implicitly know that we are not and have not been capable of living or working in this way. We must ask ourselves, in what ways are we personally and collectively complicit in our daily performances of who we are and what we do in ways that systematically shut out so many we have historically and structurally excluded from privilege? How have we, all of us, learned to covet and depend upon the rewards for these unjust systems? What are the praxis of courage we must learn to engage and perform until we listen, respect, and understand how a collective of humans can exist and work together communicatively? Guira ba, my brown body and the bodies of so many others repeatedly marginalized by our disciplinary performances of civility, failed dialogue, and adoption of progressive vocabularies demand an answer. But all of us will benefit. Guira ba.
Saramira, thank you for that powerful speech. You leave us with a lot to reflect on, to think about. Here is one of the several questions that come up. What difficult truths and/or contradictions exist in our lives and work, and how can those inform the praxis of courage that you talked about we might choose for ourselves? Next, I'd like to invite up here Sade M. Davis, an associate professor in communication at the University of Connecticut. Her research examines the way Black women leverage communication in a sister circle to invoke collective identity, erect and fortify the boundaries around home place, and backfill the necessary resources to return to white male-dominant spaces in American US society. Welcome.
Academic freedom, it's an interesting phrase, don't you think? It denotes power, rights, democracy, and privilege. But as a Black academic, I've known since that I stepped through the doors that academia is not a free place for all. And if we think about it, how can the academic institution be a free place for Black scholars like me when it was built by the hands of our enslaved ancestors, when it was funded literally off of their backs and their forced labor, and it was primarily attended by the white European beneficiaries of slave owners? Over time, that stench of chattel slavery, that stench of white supremacy, that stench of anti-Blackness has stained the carpet. It has seeped into the drywall, it has penetrated the tapestry, it has permeated the air. And it doesn't matter how many cosmetic renovations have been done to the institution across centuries. The fact remains that the smell lingers, making it never fully safe or welcoming for people like me to traipse, to think, to dream, to theorize freely. For years, folks did not want to recognize how deep the belief of white superiority was buried into the foundation of academia. And because of that, when Black folks shared that the liberal agenda of higher education is a farce, we have been met with considerable incredulity. Perhaps maybe that's because attempts to quell our speech has been rather covert. There has been this clandestine operation to delegitimize racial frameworks, to force-fit universal human theories that weren't even developed with Black people, Black culture, Black thought, Black experience in mind. Silo studies that have exclusively sampled Black and brown populations to certain journals that are not widely cited because said research is considered specialty knowledge, and dismantles the initiatives that increase Black representation and amplify the voices of Black people across academia altogether, which is very interesting because if you know anything about the research on DEI initiatives, such as affirmative action, you know the group who actually benefits from said initiatives, but I won't go there. I don't know about you, but that doesn't look like freedom to me. And there have been people who have seen what's been happening. They might take pity. They might task themselves with learning more. They might even step into the role of an accomplice, not an ally, an accomplice, and have done the work. But in each of those scenarios, the individual is upholding a belief that it's their problem. Well, surprise, surprise, my friends. In recent months, we've seen it's not just their problem, because that infrastructure of white supremacy has been leveraged for the oppression of other groups, thereby challenging one's right to exist and actively taking away one's freedom. This is why my fellow sister scholar, our ancestor who continues to look down upon us, Bell Hooks, so fittingly advanced the notion that interlocking power structures converge to produce and perpetuate the dominance of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist heteropatriarchy. So what does that mean? That means my confrontation with white supremacy works in tandem with your confrontation with imperialism as a Palestinian person, which works in your confrontation with heteropatriarchy as a woman, which works in your confrontation with capitalism as a poor working class person. And here's the gag, as the young people say. Your proximity to wealth or the wealthy class, your proximity to whiteness, your proximity to men, that will not save you. No matter how light your skin, no matter who you've married, no matter how well you follow those white capitalist models of success. This is why another ancestor of ours, Fannie Lou Hamer, so famously stated in her speech at the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971, "Nobody's free until everybody's free." So today, I don't speak to NCA. I don't speak to academia. I don't speak to one particular university or institution. Today, I'm speaking to you, the people. Because now, right now, in this moment, I'm urging everyone to understand who the real culprit is. And I know this is gonna sound crazy, but it's actually not Donald Trump. It's not a political party. It's not one voter bloc or one voter group. It's not one particular community. It's the systems that only advantage the 1%. White, heterosexual, wealthy, and I mean uber wealthy, men. And the systems that bamboozle the 99% to think that they can be the exception to the rule and can also benefit from said systems. My dear friends, my colleagues, hold my hand when I say this. Don't be bamboozled. You cannot and you will not benefit from systems that were designed to control you. It's time. It's time for us to work together. Now, I know. That sounds good, right? It's like a cute little platitude. And to be honest with you, that's a very fair response because this past election revealed that we have a lot of work to do across our respective communities, right? There have been some breaches of trust. And I see that we're in a moment where individual communities need to engage in some closed-door conversations and interrogate the xenophobia, the anti-Arab sentiment, the anti-Blackness, the misogyny, the homophobia, need I go on, but that exists within our respective, even minoritized communities. But we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So while we're doing that work within our communities, we also need to build back that trust so that we can collectively make decisions that don't impart irreparable harm on each other, yet are effective ways to resist, because we have to resist. So make no mistake, intersectional coalition building is vital. It's the 99 against the 1, y'all. We may have been minoritized, but together we are the majority. The numbers are on our side. So we gotta start acting like it. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when America directly mirrors Octavia Butler's Parable of the Talents. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. But we need to do it now. It's time to get activated, it's time to get energized, because your rights are in jeopardy just like mine. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. There's one thing I know for sure, there's two things I know for certain. There's one group that I know without a shadow of a doubt who will continue to fight, confront, and resist, and those are Black folks. And, you know, you might be thinking, why am I Black people? Well, we don't get the privilege to wait and see. Yeah. Or as the young kids say, ain't nobody finna F around and find out, okay? So herein lies the question. Are you gonna wait and see if your group is the next target? Or if things really get that bad? Or are you going to lay down your privilege, get uncomfortable, join the coalition and fight now? The choice is yours.
Thank you, Sade, for such a powerful speech there. And we have a lot of work to do, all of us. And here is a question that Sade has posed to us for reflection. What are the barriers to intersectional coalition building in a post-election era? What meaningful work can you do to address those barriers? And you should say that in her voice, like, what are you going to do? She's going to come get you. So up next, it's my pleasure to welcome Julianne Scott Pollock. So Julianne Scott Pollock is a professor of communication and performance studies at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where she directs the Performance Studies program. Her narrative ethnographic research explores intersections of stigmatized embodiment, disability, and gender identity through performance in daily life. She's the author of Embodied Performance as Applied Research, Art and Pedagogy, and regularly publishes in journals such as the Text in Performance Quarterly and Qualitative Inquiry. It's a pleasure to have you here and talk to us. Julianne, welcome.
I have 7 minutes to relay insights from former critical disability scholars in our discipline. I have 7 minutes to recount hours of conversations in the hallway of this convention. I have 7 minutes to explain why they are no longer here. I have 7 minutes to articulate how ableism constricts academic freedom. I have 7 minutes to compel you that their experience is also yours, that it matters personally, not just in theory because you think you're a good person who cares about people like us. I have 7 minutes to ask a question to help us solve this together. I have 7 minutes to relay the complicated reality of academic freedom for bodies defined only as the antithesis of normal. I have 7 minutes to explain what disabled bodies know. Disabled bodies know marginalization. It's what connects us. Other identity groups have shared food, language, music, fashion, art. We only have a shared reality of navigating oppression, of being bodies openly and objectively devalued by medical experts, diagnosed as lacking, in need of treatment, care, of ongoing accommodation, of management, in a capitalist culture that defines success by independence, self-reliance, and productivity. New disability scholars are attracted to the hopeful enlightenment of the academy. They enter the National Communication Association eager to work together, to collaborate with like-minded people, to build coalitions with scholars beyond disability. Then they are confused. They realize that other identity scholars have worked so hard throughout their history to not be deemed medically, objectively wrong, inferior. These other scholars have compassion for us, but they want to keep their distance. We're not the same. It's not personal, just academic survival. The institution needs money, the organization needs money, the professor needs money. Capitalism exalts money. They say that's primarily why our country elected a felon who mocked disabled bodies, refused to watch the Paralympics because it made him uncomfortable. Diagnosed deficient bodies make us uncomfortable. And academic freedom is complicated by the discomfort of those in power. So those of us who have made it in the discipline, the tenured, the published, the cited, the invited, the celebrated, explain how to pivot away from deemed deficiency. Over coffee, over dinner, after sessions, we explain, emphasize your methodological training, your expansive theoretical background, how well-rounded you are. To be a disability scholar means to know all the other theories. They all connect mortal, vulnerable bodies and social policy. Look, that's how you get a job. And tenure, publications, citations, invitations, awards. And once you have all of these, well, then you'll have academic freedom. To say what needs to be said, to do what needs to be done. Except, well, be careful with that. In this climate, you're not all that powerful. People are on edge. They're angry about difference. They don't want to talk about bodies that need support. The vote has spoken. The money matters. It's how we sustain, especially us, with the strain we put on the group health insurance. Throughout our history, disability scholars unite against injustice, against genocide. Palestine is a disability issue. Against attacks on bodily autonomy, women's rights are a disability issue. Against the denial of health care, trans rights are a disability issue. Against marriage inequality, gay rights are a disability issue. Against restricted freedoms, civil rights are a disability issue. These attacks, they're all part of our shared story. A story of oppression, isolation, ostracization. Disability scholars know. Now, we're noticing academic freedom is under attack. Constricted, diluted by capitalist ideals, they pour in contempt for the weak, despise for difference, grudge against openness, bitterness towards intellectualism. until freedom is hard to taste in this academic drink we're choking down. And I understand why so many of the disability scholars I've met at past conventions are gone. They refuse to rebrand in the capitalist institution to something deemed more productive. They refuse to change their questions and methods to satisfy the dominant voices who deem their work shoddy, not rigorous, irrelevant. They left. They shifted away to law, policy, social services, administration. Somewhere they hope they can promote change. I hope they can too. I have 2 minutes left to ask you to recognize the constraints of academic freedom within a capitalist culture that values autonomy and productivity over all else. You see, disabled bodies deemed abnormal by the power of medical institutions, we hold the weight of all human mortality. Because we're diagnosed disabled, marked by ableist stigma, categorized as the wrong bodies, other right bodies, those granted non-disabled status, can escape the reality that we're all temporary, aging, vulnerable, inescapably breaking down. But if we embrace that reality and value instead of ignore mortality, we grow aware that when we unite, when we resist capital ideals meant to divide us into good and bad academic workers, we make space for the work that needs to be done. But this means rethinking value, rethinking productivity, rebranding success, recommitting to academic freedom beyond economic sustainability. I don't know if this is possible from where we are. I know it's uncomfortable to acknowledge vulnerability when no one is requiring you to. And so I ask, how can NCA promote academic freedom while dependent on the capitalist model for sustainability?
As we reflect on Julianne's very important question on how we can promote, as members of NCA, academic freedom while still being dependent on capitalist model for sustainability, I'd next like to welcome our final speaker, Brian J. McCann. Brian J. McCann, he, him pronouns, is a professor of rhetoric and cultural studies in the Department of Communication Studies at Louisiana State University, right here. He writes and teaches on topics such as crime and public culture, the cultural politics of higher education, mental illness and addiction, and social movements. He's the author of one book and has published articles in journals such as Communication Critical Cultural Studies, Rhetoric Society Quarterly, and Women's Studies in Communication. Welcome to you, Brian.
Good evening. Welcome to Louisiana. This opening session occurs amid heightened attacks against higher education and the principle we call academic freedom. It also comes in the aftermath of the 2023 NCA presidential address, which of course never happened. According to the NCA Executive Committee's summary of findings by the Ad-Hoc Presidential Address Inquiry Committee, so many committees, quote, some members of NCA staff pressured elected officers to cancel or alter the presidential address panel, reportedly over concerns that multiple scripts included terms such as genocide and free Palestine, and linked NCA to white supremacy and colonialism, which would do irreparable harm to NCA. As one of the slated speakers who was present when it all went down, I have no quarrel with the committee's summary of events. But as last month's commemoration of the October 7, 2023 Hamas offensive against Israel revealed, origin stories matter. Those of us who understand the so-called Middle East conflict as a national liberation struggle waged by Palestinians against Israeli occupation have repeatedly disputed the hegemonic notion that the carnage of October 7, 2023 inaugurated Israel's genocidal campaign against the Gaza Strip. Rather, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is a continuation of a broader, decades-spanning colonial project. And a lot is at stake in the difference between a legitimate act of sovereign self-defense by Israel or, on the other hand, the manifestation of a sustained presupposition of the disposability of Palestinian life. Origin stories matter. And origin stories matter for NCA because we have been here before. In 2008 and 2010, the NCA convention occurred at hotels under labor boycotts. Each time, NCA staff and leadership warned that relocating the conference would bankrupt the organization. A few years later, the NCA National Office proposed changing the organization's bylaws to significantly diminish the Legislative Assembly's governing power. The desire to do so, the association's leaders told us, was a function of fiduciary responsibility, which the Oxford English Dictionary explains, remember, refers to holding something in trust. Around this time, several colleagues and I presented a resolution to the Legislative Assembly calling for a boycott of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, following its unhiring of Palestinian Indigenous Studies scholar Stephen Saleta. The resolution failed in part due to arguments that academic boycotts undermine the principle of academic freedom and would likely do irreparable harm to NCA as a learned society. I take this stroll down memory lane not to air old grievances, but to outline a genealogy central to recent engagements by NCA with matters of freedom. It is an attempt to resist what Logan Ray Gomez calls temporal containment, or efforts to rhetorically fix enactments of structural violence in a set chronology that obscures their connections to broader regimes of domination. I was struck by the first item in the listed findings of the Presidential Address Inquiry Committee. It reads, quote, "The committee's investigation concluded that all NCA staff and officers involved in this incident acted in what they perceived to be the best interests of NCA and its members. These actors, despite their sharply divergent perspectives regarding the events of NCA 2023, allegedly held the association in trust. Such is their fiduciary responsibility." In a 2019 lecture at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, Stephen Saleta says of academic freedom, quote, "It is at once sovereign and derivative. Raise a revolutionary politics and you'll quickly encounter the limits of civil liberties." Saleta's words illustrate how academic freedom presupposes its own kind of fiduciary responsibility, which is loyalty to the university itself. As communication scholars such as Jessica Hattrick and Matthew Hudick have powerfully demonstrated, the university, despite its cosmopolitan pretenses, is ultimately a white supremacist and colonial enterprise. It is, to paraphrase Ursula J. Orr's insights at the recent biennial public address conference, the master's house. And as Abigail Boggs, Eli Meyerhoff, Nick Mitchell, and Zach Schwartz-Weinstein argue, some academics' investments in a bygone golden era, wherein the university operated as a legitimate incubator for knowledge, function to neutralize those critiques that would undermine the university itself. For academic freedom cannot fathom critique without the university. To defend academic freedom, at least in the US, is to defend the university. Just as loyalty to NCA necessarily constrains our capacity to imagine it as a modality for freedom, academic freedom's investments in the university, a vast network of relations of which NCA is surely part, limits the radical imaginings that gesture toward that elusive thing named freedom. Academic freedom, in the last instance, collapses under the weight of its contradictions. It is a sometimes necessary proxy for larger freedom dreams. But as is the risk with all proxies, something inevitably gets lost in translation. Whatever origin stories we end up telling about NCA's role in matters of academic freedom, this panel is undeniably a function of 2023's debacle. It is a reckoning. But NCA has been reckoning with questions of freedom for as long as I have been a member and well before that. And reckoning is exhausting. And if it is exhausting for a cis, white, straight-passing man and full professor such as myself, imagine the toll it takes on the most oppressed, exploited, and precarious among us. But as Robert Mejia has written, one need not imagine very much. Such scholars have been telling us of their experiences for decades. Imagination in this instance is a function of willful ignorance. So rather than offering concrete steps that NCA should take to demonstrably hold academic freedom in greater regard, I conclude instead with the contention that however we move forward, we do so with a resolute, defiant, and paradoxically hopeful pessimism, with the knowledge that our freedom lies somewhere beyond. Whatever principles ground our investments in our organizations, disciplines, or institutions, none are sufficiently expansive to accommodate the freedom dreams that mobilize us toward freedom's horizons. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for urging us to think about radical imaginations and freedoms beyond. You leave us with this question to reflect on: what closely held practices, principles, resources, and institutions are we willing to lose in the service of freedom? A very provocative question for us to pause and reflect on. And next, I would like to bring up all of the questions that our fantastic panelists have put together for you to respond, reflect, and reimagine in radical ways. How do we combat the ways in which the construction of fear is weaponized in service of supremacist structures? To what extent do you, as an educator or learner, participate in, benefit from, or succeed in the system that curbs academic freedom? What difficult truths and/or contradictions exist in our lives and work, and how can those inform the praxis of courage we might choose for ourselves? What are the barriers to intersectional coalition building in a post-election era? What meaningful work can you do to address those barriers? How can NCA promote academic freedom while dependent on capitalist modes of, my eyesight is not very good here, dependent on the capitalist model for sustainability? And what closely held practices, principles, resources, or institutions are we willing to lose in the service of freedom? Thank you. First, I want to thank the panelists for amazing, wonderful presentations and words for us to think about and reflect on. So let's give them a round of applause. We'd like to welcome any comments or reflections. There are mics here if anybody would like to come up to share their thoughts. Please introduce yourself and ask the question, please. Yeah, we can we have the lights on, please? LaShawn? Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Paul Siegel. I'm emeritus from the University of Hartford, and I'd like to focus on the challenge based to us by our undergraduate participant, who I think was saying much more politely than I'll put it now, to what extent are we part of the problem rather than the solution? And my take on that is true confession time. We know within the left it's a self-parody that we play the more oppressed than thou game. There's another game I think we play within higher ed, and that's the less privileged than thou game. And so if we're less privileged than you, then, oh, we don't count so much, so we're not so much of the problem. And within academia, you can always almost break it down into how many courses per semester are you required to teach, and the number goes down generally as the prestige and the salary goes up. Anyway, it just makes me think about to what extent many of us in this room, myself included, have played the game of thinking, oh, those are the really privileged ones. I'm not one of those. Thank you for your challenge. Thank you.
Sienna, would you like to reflect on that? Or, just take this? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the comment. Yes, please. You can use that mic. I think that works.
Is it on? Oh, yes, working. All right, my name is Mohammed Alauddin, and I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at St. Mary's College in Indiana. I want to share and also remind everyone a report published by Oxfam International in 2016. The report was about the 1% of economy of 1%, and it said that only 62 individuals own the amount of wealth possessed by the lower half of the world population. In 2018, these statistics went down to single digit. Only about 8, if I'm mistaken, or 9 individuals had the amount of wealth possessed by the lower half of the world population. Another report, during the last 18 consecutive years, the indicators of global democracy are in decline. My question for NCA and everyone, what does NCA stands for within this context of unprecedented inequality in the 21st century? And then the second thing is about the Palestine. I don't want to add anything, but I want to invite everyone to relate to yourself that probably in last week or months, we didn't check what's going on in Palestine. The imagery bombarded or came to us through many different channels, perhaps desensitized our conscience. Perhaps we are numb, and I'm really terrified. Probably this numbness or this sensitiveness will lead us to stay silent and close our eyes when more atrocities or genocide or ethnic cleansing will be taking place in the world in future.
Yes.
My question is, what does humanism or humanitarianism mean in this moment? And is there any color of humanism and humanitarianism? And the last question is, within such context, does academic freedom have color? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Would anybody like to talk about wealth inequalities and their implications for academic freedom? Perhaps donors or other ways?
I don't know. Is this on? Oops. Hello? I'm going to check these. Let's check and make sure. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. Just super quickly, I mean, one of the things that I think I want to, thank you for those comments. One of the things I want to say is we actually have a panel in the Swana Caucus on dehumanization. Dehumanization of Palestinians, among many other groups, but I'm going to be focused on Palestinians, has been going on for decades. And it's only that way in which we get to a place where a genocide is possible. In fact, the Holocaust museums, it's well known that dehumanization is a required step to get to genocide, not just for Palestinians, but for a whole host of communities that have experienced it across history. So that's number one. And it, of course, has implications for academic freedom. The second is, where is NCA? So we have undocumented folks in our discipline who are not here because they're too scared to travel. Where is NCA? And this is a question, I'm on the NCA Executive Committee, et cetera, and we need to hold us responsible. Where is NCA from the undocumented community right now? The trans community has been targeted directly also by Trump. Where's NCA for the trans community? What are some things beyond words that NCA, and I could go on and on about communities, but these are the two that have really been for the focus of the Trump administration and its campaign, at least, you know. So what are we gonna commit, what are we gonna require of NCA beyond words? Do we need, right now we don't have an advocacy position. Do we need an advocacy director? Where's the budget and how does it relate to things that we do or don't want? These are all, they're not easy necessarily in some ways, but if we're gonna do beyond words, we need to require and demand more, and we need to have hard conversations about where our budget goes. That's all I'll say for now.
Anybody else want to respond to that question? Any last questions or comments?
Is this still on?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dana Cloud. I am now at the University of Cincinnati, and I'm reflecting on this question about benefiting and contradictions because I took a position as the director of the School of Communication, Film and Media Studies after adjuncting for 5 years in the Cal State University system. And if my colleagues are here, I just want you to know that if my colleagues are here, I just want you to know you hired me, and you know who I am. So here goes. I want to ask all the people who have administrative roles, who have any kind of leadership at all, maybe a head, maybe a dean, to actually pledge to aid and abet, to be an accomplice for resistance struggles among students, among staff, among faculty of all ranks. When the students are in encampments, we pledge to be there. I'm there. When my faculty are on strike, I'm there. When the staff are struggling, I want to be there. I'm not saying I'm totally consistent and not in any way, but I do think that defending is one thing for sure, and I'm sure that I will be called upon, and we will all be called upon, as we are presently, to defend people whose voices are muted and freedoms are curtailed in all of the beautiful and awful ways that were described. But you know, we have words and we have money, some, a little, and I think that we actually, if you are in a similar situation, to actually take a step out of the comfort zone and say, as someone who is in a position to do something and to actually materially invest in defending our people, that I would urge all of you to do that.
Absolutely. On that amazing, important note that all of us are leaders in some way, shape, or form, but especially some of us are have titles that are of leadership titles as deans or chairs, and you know, it's really important the point that was made in terms of pledging your support, being there, putting your body on the line, putting some material support, if possible, for defending academic freedom. So on that wonderful note of hope and also of courage and of responsibility, the shared responsibilities that all of us have, I would like to ask you to congratulate these wonderful panelists again for bringing to the forefront so many important and multiple and intersectional ways in which academic freedom is something that we should fight to keep alive in our campuses, in our discipline, and within NCA. Thank you so much.